I'm reminded of the deeply touching letters, cards, and messages which so many of you have sent my wife.
Fire consumes all in its path: objects, emotions, and pride. Queen Camilla, a royal with a wounded ego, became both the spark and the flame of this particular fire. Her rebellion scorched the royal household, breeding awkwardness, bruising egos, and dismissing staff. She burned through everything to reach the top, yet when the flames died down, all that remained was smoke, silence, and the question: was the crown worth the ashes? And what did the king do to diffuse the entire situation? Join us as we unveil the shocking event that ensued after Camilla destroyed the king's biggest royal event. The fuel-soaked banquet. A once-in-a-lifetime summit was to be held at Windsor. The event was meant to be a crowning achievement for King Charles III. It was supposed to be one of his first major state banquets since ascending the throne. The guest list was a constellation of global power. Presidents, diplomats, and dignitaries all gathered to celebrate a new era of the British monarchy, with the prominent guests being German President Walter Steinmeier and his wife. This was King Charles's moment to project the stability, tradition, and strength of the monarchy to the world. It was a much-needed moment in his reign, as his regime was still under public speculation and criticism after the hectic transitional period it had been going through. Some would say it was still going through a transitional period, which is why showcasing heritage and strength is significant. This was no longer just a democratic protocol. It was an event to show that this new system had something worth believing in. In the making of the British monarchy, almost no event is more laden with symbolic weight than a sovereign's first state banquet. It is more than a dinner. It is a declaration of intent, the first definitive chapter written in the history of a new reign. For King Charles III, this was to be his grand debut on the world stage. A perfect act was needed on this stage to dissolve any lingering doubts about the stability of the crown after the 70-year reign of his legendary mother. The venue, the Windsor Castle reception, would later be the source of unwanted rumors surrounding the two highest-ranking members of the royal household. Britain became shaken by rumors of a night with its talons edged in history, threatening to tear down all that was built. A night only two people know the full details of, a night sealed in the royal family's utmost confidential files. It was meant to be a very significant night in October, a state banquet. The fuel to this fire that would later consume the royal household was harvested with the Windsor night in mind. A night where everyone would want to stand out was sure to create rounds among a royal household. A type of household where everyone loves to stand out. It was the perfect hunting ground for fuel. Fuel to start a fire, a monarch consuming fire. Queen Camilla was one such fuel-soaked royal. She needed the attention it brought. She craved it. She wanted to be at the forefront, in the headlines, and at the base of everything. She wanted the spotlight to be on her. At this point, this diplomatic gathering wasn't just a chance for the royal family to prove themselves. It was a chance for the Queen to prove herself, prove her worth to an audience who didn't even realize they were in fact an audience. It was well known that any imperfection would be taken up by the press, and King Charles didn't want this. He carefully mapped out everything pertaining to this event so as to avoid leaks and mishaps. These leaks and mishaps came hand in hand and were always a constant worry for his household. He was right to be wary. Even in places where there were no mishaps, rumors and speculations always found avenues to grow. It was always a dilemma, but this time at least, King Charles wanted perfection. Perfection in Windsor. It was truly a matter that could not be taken lightly. This upcoming gathering in Britain. King Charles wanted to be careful and keep things simple, but his wife, Queen Camilla, wanted to be grand and be in the spotlight. How did this fuel manage to meet a spark that would later grow into a fire? A meeting filled with sparks. King Charles III wasted no time. He swiftly called a meeting to lay out his plans and expectations for Windsor. He understood that clarity and direction were vital in a household shaken by turmoil. Every member needed to hear his voice steady and reassuring enough to restore order and purpose. Yet he also knew leadership was not a one-way path. The royal household depended on his guidance to function, but he too depended on their loyalty and discipline to uphold the crown's dignity. In his mind, the monarchy was a living organism. The people, its limbs, the palace, its heart, and he, its steady lungs. If one faltered, the entire body would stumble. And so this meeting was not merely about control, it was about survival, unity, and reclaiming balance before the kingdom's flame dimmed beyond repair during this fragile period. The stage for this pivotal confrontation was the Green Drawing Room at Windsor, a place bathed in the gracefulness of royal history. Portraits of royal monarchs hung in frames. Their painted eyes silently bore witness to their legacy. Around a vast mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, sat the architects of royal tradition, the royal household. King Charles, seated at the head of the table, was in his element. A man who had waited a lifetime for this role, he possessed what it took to lead this monarchy. They were to discuss sovereign plans regarding this upcoming event and all related to it. Present there were members of the monarchy, members of his own personal household, and other high-ranking officials. He wasted no time in dishing out outlines and responsibilities to the individuals at hand. This was seen as protocol, but would later be known as the breeding ground for the sparks that started the fire. He assigned responsibilities to the staff and everyone present, reserving the most critical roles for high-ranking officials and members of his own household. King Charles harbored no bias and gave these responsibilities as he saw fit. Prince William was in charge of the ceremony proceedings and was to be present during the opening toast. Princess Anne was charged with everything security-related, especially regarding the foreign officials who were to attend. Princess Kate was charged with overseeing media and imagery throughout all phases of the event. Finally, Queen Camilla was given the title of handling the banquet seating and reception room decorations, a title from which she felt a disrespectful blow. The role of the Queen Consort was outlined as basically non-main character duties. The language used was a lexicon of ceremonial restraint. She would be accompanying the king. She would be in support of the sovereign's duties. Her position in the receiving line was designated to a specific spot, inches behind her husband, something she absolutely didn't have in mind. Her conversational pairings for the evening were pre-selected, focusing on the spouses of visiting dignitaries, important yet secondary figures. She was restricted. To her, she was being held captive and told what to do. Throughout this portion of the briefing, Queen Camilla remained a house of awkwardness. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the documents before her. Not a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Yet every mention of the word support and every proposed royal boundary landed like a blow against her own sense of identity, a blow against her plans for the spotlight. Awkwardness presumed. Those present in and around her position saw how uncomfortable she was. This elephant in the room was no hidden phenomenon from Prince William, who stole glances at the Queen, narrowly avoiding eye contact on multiple occasions. She was shocked to her core. This overcast cloud was not invisible to Anne and Kate either, as the tension shift became increasingly apparent. The Queen shifted positions, fumbled with her hands and papers, pursed her lips, and fidgeted. Surprisingly, all this was still lost on the king. This bruised her ego. She felt caged and unseen, the exact opposite of what she envisioned. Through all this, she stayed quiet. Quiet and uncomfortable were the perfect words to describe her demeanor on that occasion. The meeting concluded as all such meetings do. The king, satisfied with the strength and safety of the plan, gave his formal assent. He declared it excellent and instructed those present to proceed as outlined. With a collective subtle bow of their heads, the courtiers gathered their papers. They had received their orders from the king, and in their world, that was the end of the matter. As they filed out of the green drawing room, they were confident in the flawless blueprint they had created. They left the king and queen alone, surrounded by the silent portraits of history, entirely unaware that the most crucial part of the plan, the queen's compliance, was a variable they had never even considered. They had secured the king's approval, but utterly failed to secure the queen's consent. In matters like this, the king usually has the final say. But what happens when this final say harms his partner and second-in-command? If he is blind to these feelings, then what exactly are these feelings? And were they justified? Sentiments of the egoistical queen. When stating the roles, the king remained focused and intent, looking at each member present, taking in everything. He spoke with authority and presence. In some ways, it felt like he did know that Camilla wasn't going to be contemptuous with the role given to her, hence why he mentioned her name last. As he mentioned her name, he lowered his voice and calmly looked at her before stating her role on the banquet sittings and handling of reception room decor. This statement was said to have hastily plunged the room into silence. William glanced once more at Camilla, and Anne bowed her head to rearrange her papers to avoid the queen's gaze. Camilla sat still, her hands trembling and her expression uneven. To her, this was one of the greatest betrayals. She saw herself as someone who had stood beside Charles through thick and thin through these years with the utmost support and love a partner could give. She didn't deserve this hostile treatment, and at the very least, she didn't deserve to be reduced to a palace aide. The king continued in his oblivious state. He mentioned that all protocol was to be followed with not even a slight defiance, and there was to be no form of resistance to these outlined procedures. Camilla turned pale to the point where she was almost unrecognizable as a royal. Her lips dry as if thirst had hung with her since birth, and her eyes dim as though she had just seen a massacre for the 100th time. It was one of the words she hated the most. Protocol. It felt like she had been caged. The king, who just wanted a spotless performance from his household, just further emphasized that they were to show the utmost recognition of authority with no form of unilateral action or disobedience. Another arrow pierced Camilla. It was as if these statements were intentionally structured to put her in a spot which she didn't want to be in at all. The word "beyond authority" felt like the last straw and a directed attack at her. It touched what she hated most, being controlled. She became a wounded wolf, and hostility surged through her, driving the need to prove herself and strike back. As the meeting ended, other members left. It was just a matter of time before the queen lost her cool, so she stood up and walked frantically away from the room. King Charles noticed this, and as he turned to his wife, he found no shared sense of satisfaction. Instead, he was met with a silence that was harder and colder than the marble fireplace. It felt like he was gazing at something about to burst. Camilla's composure was no longer one of regal grace, but of barely suppressed fury. The years of practiced control were chipping at the edges, and the sentiments she had held back for decades were finally surfacing. This was not just about a dinner party, it was about her very existence within the monolithic structure of the crown. For over 30 years, she had been a focus for public opinion. She had endured the scorn of a nation, the relentless hounding of the press, and the open hostility of members of the very institution she was now meant to help lead. She had weathered it all, with gritted teeth and unwavering loyalty to Charles, believing that one day her service and her sacrifice would be fully recognized. Now, at the zenith of her journey, on the cusp of the event, that would cement her status as queen. She was being handed a script that reduced her to a decorative extra. It was more than an insult, it was an invalidation of her entire life's struggle. To be told to simply smile and support was to erase the formidable strategist who had helped Charles navigate the treacherous path to the throne. It was a demand that she become the caricature her enemies had always painted. A woman of ambition who, having gotten what she wanted, was now expected to fade quietly into the background. Now, what remained of this once proud woman was a wounded animal seeking validation and revenge. Against the utmost authority, what would this animal do to reclaim pride? Authority. Up in flames. As the palace burst into frantic preparations for the upcoming gathering, staff were seen as busy and intent with their newfound purpose and responsibilities in an attempt to meet the deadline. Preparations were being made at a freakish pace, and suddenly the Queen was nowhere to be found. She held a crucial part in the success of the event, but decided to take the role of a ghost instead. Royal staff had said they saw her entering her private chambers. They recalled her walking into it looking defeated and perturbed. She also gave orders to be alone. At this, she displayed numerous hostile behavioral patterns, whilst the other factions of the palace were in a frenzy, trying to get things done. By noon, she was still locked up in her private room, unseen. Members of the royal staff made numerous attempts to call her out as they grew worried, but it was all to no avail. They still tried to cheer her up, bringing her tea on numerous occasions. This tea was left unattended and grew cold with time. The large mirror in her private room reflected exhaustion, but on the inside, Camilla housed suppressed fury, just like a time bomb waiting to reach its climax. She stared and stared, lost in reflection, her thoughts fueled by anger and hurt. In that private room, she allowed only her confidant, Mrs. Hill. Looking into the mirror, she sat deep in thought, muttering to herself over and over, "Reception room decorations, reception room decorations." Each repetition was laced with scoffs, sarcasm, and disbelief. A role that multiple queens have taken up in the past now seemed like an insult to her person. Moments before, Camilla had already sent a proposed plan to the king and committee, which had been approved. Mrs. Hill, upon hearing her mistress's exclamations, hesitated in worry and pity. After a brief moment, she proceeded to ask, with a slight bow and straight expression, if she could report back to the king on the reception plans and seating arrangements. The queen snapped out of her hate-induced trance for a moment. This was the moment that gave her the extra push to make an attacking decision against the authorities of the monarchy. Camilla smiled faintly and, in a low voice, remarked that these meetings were meetings, and these decisions were decisions, but that she would rearrange everything in her own way that night. Upon hearing this, Mrs. Hill bowed in adherence, not daring to ask more. She knew there was no way to stop the Queen. Later, recounting this, Mrs. Hill said as she looked at the Queen's eyes, they looked like the eyes of someone resolved, willing to go to the end to counter humiliation. As the afternoon fell, Charles returned to the library, and after walking through the hall, he seemed pleased with the progress, and that all was going according to plan, not knowing that in the adjacent room, his beloved wife, Camilla, was preparing to start a fire, aiming to rewrite fate, a fire burning the monarch's balance and authority. The head of the monarch himself started a fire. In that adjacent room, Camilla pulled out a copy of the state banquet plan approved by the secretary that had been delivered after every detail was approved by Charles's guest list. Every detail from the opening speeches to the closing credits. In that document, she read and reread and found that no part included her. Her eyes grew cold and she lit Windsor up. She burned the document. She set ablaze royal pride and dignity that night. Charles walked up on her during this act and looked on with silent anger, and a numbness in his eyes. Fist clenched, he questioned what was going on, but she paid no heed to what he was saying. She simply stared coldly at the fire as it slowly burned the pages of the documents. It was said that fire burned the last bit of affection he had towards her. With this action, has Camilla finally gotten the attention she wanted? Or will she go to further lengths to make sure her presence is felt? What she did next was even worse. Coup d'état, the Queen's battlefield. With the king still a little bit paralyzed by shock, Queen Camilla launched her next campaign with ruthless speed. She wasn't satisfied in the least. She still felt the king's silence on her actions as an insult. The next day, she called on her trusted aide, Mrs. Hill. The burning hurt was not enough. She needed to assert dominance. She was fed up and felt the need to leave her mark on the royal household. She looked around her with disgust-filled eyes. Everything needed a change. Everything needed to suit her, and everything needed to be for her. This was her perceived moment, and she wanted to seize it and become the main character. To Mrs. Hill she gave out orders, and her first act involved a brutal purge. Key royal loyalists and staff were dismissed overnight by terse, impersonal phone calls, their decades of service disregarded. By dawn, her own hand-picked team of personnel with ties from Wiltshire had arrived, replacing the old guard. A silent coup was issued, the authority was overturned, and she had finally made her big step. The new staff's sudden entry and energy swept through the royal walls, plunging the remaining household staff into a state of fearful confusion as loyalties were tested and centuries of protocol were cast aside. "What is happening?" was the question that echoed through the walls of the castle amidst preparation. What was the Queen doing? Windsor's corridors became the front lines of a silent war. A coup was just a bold step to be seen. The coup's most audacious move was both symbolic and deeply personal. On Camilla's direct and unyielding orders, iconic portraits of the late Queen Elizabeth II were removed from the walls of the Grand Corridor. In their place, large formal portraits of Camilla herself were installed. The message was unmistakable and shocking to the Loyalist staff. The Elizabethan era was over, and a new queen was seizing absolute control. The castle was transformed into her private court, the grand banquet remade in her glamorous, modern image. She changed color, carpets, monuments, everything. The king remained isolated, reported to be ill, a prisoner in his own home, watching with disdain as his authority was publicly and systematically dismantled. Disgruntled, he called on Prince William. He needed help. He needed help fast. But a coup built on shock and awe alone cannot last. It needs truth, strength, and dignity. The Queen had forgotten that a king, however weakened, is never truly alone. Prince William saves the day. The king, perhaps held by a dilemma of personal ties versus the crown's loyalty, was weakened. He was dumbfounded and didn't know what to do. He sat in deep reflection and finally summoned up courage. He called on the prince. That was the only avenue he saw out of this predicament. The Queen continued in her diabolical acts, and in the night, the turning point came with the unexpected arrival of the Prince of Wales. He found a castle he barely recognized, a battlefield of competing loyalties where portraits of his grandmother were gone and the staff moved with fear. William's arrival was greeted with confusion as the place of his childhood now felt alien. A short moment was enough for him to know he needed a change. He took to the king, the head of the household, who held the power to put any real change into effect. William's confrontation with his father was marked by anger and stark reality. He framed Camilla's actions not as modernization or whatever front she proposed, but as a reckless coup that dishonored the late Queen's legacy and jeopardized the very institution he was destined to inherit. the same institution they had fought to protect and build. "This isn't strength," he argued. "It's anarchy, and it's handed our critics a priceless victory." That conversation was the wake-up call for King Charles. A husband's mental paralysis gave way to a king's resolve. His lifetime of training and his sacred duty to the crown finally overpowered his personal allegiance. The decision, once made, was absolute and chillingly formal. A decree was drawn up and signed by the king's own hand, ordering Camilla's immediate and indefinite suspension from all public life. He signed the decree, and immediately the media took it up. By morning, it was all over, but in another form. Word had been passed that the Queen was taking a prolonged sick leave from all duties. Her destination was a remote abbey in Yorkshire, a place of religious silence and reflection, a sanctuary. Her silent coup was met with a silent exile. In the dead of night, a private convoy of dark cars moved her out of Windsor. The Queen, who had demanded a new reign, had been completely and utterly erased from it. The car held no attachment to royal value. It was as discreet as possible to hide from the media. It was said her time in the sanctuary was one of silence and reflection. She was in shock. She didn't protest. The deed had already been done at a freakish pace. She couldn't keep up and was burned by the flames she started. The sanctuary was filled with nuns and the like. She stayed in a solitary room with minimal facilities, unbefitting of a queen, a truly humbling experience. Finally, the truth surfaced, and the media began reporting. King Charles was praised as a true leader and an example of restraint. He was seen as the epitome of calmness amidst the greatest of turmoils. It marked a quiet, peaceful era, one in which she no longer existed or needed to exist. Her name just floated by. It was neither mentioned with contempt nor with respect. The media and everyone moved on from this uncanny wildfire, which lasted a few days. It was her biggest nightmare fulfilled. She had been forgotten. What do you think of the king's final decision to exile his own queen? Was it a necessary act of a strong monarch protecting the crown, or a cruel overreaction to his wife's ambition? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.